This episode of Literary Treks is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading, in case I got bored.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 234 of Literary Treks, your dedicated Star Trek books and comics show here on the Trek FM network. I'm just one of your hosts, Dan Gunther, but joining me as he does every week is the world-renowned Bruce Gibson. Bruce, how's it going today?
I am doing fine. Hi-ya! I'm doing my karate moves right now. And you'll know why in a minute.
Excellent. Yeah, I see you practicing some sort of strange martial art that I'm not familiar with. It looks kind of familiar, but I can't quite place it.
It's like if you karate chop someone like at the neck, bam, they go down. It's great.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I see you like swinging your fists while clasped together like a club. I don't know. Does that actually work? That doesn't look like... I mean, I don't know.
You know what? I mentioned that to my wife one time, who's a physical therapist, and she was like, well, actually, technically, if you did do and hit in the right whatever, I'm like, seriously, come on. And she goes, I know it's a stretch, but I'm just saying.
Well, that brings us to the only item we really have in our news today, and some of you might already know what we're talking about here. A special form of martial arts that some people refer to as Kirk Fu. So, interesting. We've got actually a book coming out, Star Trek, Kirk Fu Manual, an introduction to the Final Frontier's most feared martial art. So yeah, we've got this coming on March 5th, 2019. So that'll be early next year. And Dayton Ward, friend of the show and frequent Star Trek writer, is writing this book. So, yeah, this looks pretty interesting.
So, I'm sure Dayton has practiced a lot of these moves in order to write this book, because there's no way you can write a book about Kirk Fu unless you have actually tried it and have studied it. So I'm very interested to see, maybe at STLV, he will show us some of those moves on stage. I'd be very interested to see that.
Definitely. We'll have to get some footage of that and, maybe provide that as a bonus if we're able to get that, because that would be a lot of fun for sure. But yeah, this is an illustrated guide from Insight Books that is, quote, a one-of-a-kind fighting manual which showcases the unique combat style of Captain James T. Kirk. So this looks like it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, hardcover book, 64 pages, so there's going to be a lot of moves in there. And so when that comes out in March, then sometime later in 2019, when you go to conventions for Star Trek-related things, you're going to see people actually doing these moves in the hallway, I'm sure, in their cosplay.
Excellent. And yeah, so it's got a price point right now on Amazon of $14.99. It can be pre-ordered now. So take a look at that, check that out. And you know what? We're going to have to put this on the schedule and maybe have Dayton come on to talk about this book, because this looks like it's going to be a lot of fun.
Or this should be a special YouTube episode so we can see Dayton do the moves.
We'll have to probably buy him a few drinks before we get to that point, but you never know. We'll see what we can do for sure.
Well, I'm sure if we buy him a few drinks, he will definitely do this for us.
Perfect. Well, speaking of authors, we've got a special feature in today's episode. We're talking to James Swallow, author of the recent Star Trek Discovery novel Fear Itself. So what do you say we cut this preliminary stuff and go straight into the feature?
I'm kind of scared. I mean, I'm fearful of talking about this book. I feel very Saru right now.
Well, you just have to work really hard to overcome that and make some command decisions.
Aye, aye, Captain.
Well, today we're talking about the latest Star Trek Discovery novel, Fear Itself, by writer James Swallow. And we have the author himself here to talk about his book. So, James, thank you so much for coming on Literary Treks.
Hey, guys. Always good to be on board. A pleasure to be invited back. Thank you.
Excellent. Always glad to have you on, especially to talk about one of the few new releases that we get this year. So it almost seems like kind of a rare occasion to be able to do a show like this about a new Star Trek book release. So very happy to have you aboard.
Oh, great.
Well, let's jump right into it. We've talked to both David Mack and Dayton Ward about their process in writing for Discovery, and it's a little bit different than it has been in the past with other Star Trek novels. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of writing this novel. And did you, for example, work closely with the Discovery writing staff and Kirsten Beyer in putting it together?
Yeah, I mean, probably a lot of what I'm going to say is pretty similar to what Dave and Dayton have said. We were into this like a year before I think it was announced that we were going to be involved with the project. So if you can imagine the scene, I get an email from Kirsten, who, I'd worked with before on a couple other projects, and she was very complimentary about some of my writing, and I was very complimentary about hers because we're all good pals and we all read each other's stuff. Right? And she'd really liked what I did with Sight Unseen, which was my last Star Trek Titan novel. And so when, I knew about her getting on Discovery, and I sent her a message saying, wow, that's so cool to see you on board. Because it really made us all feel like having someone who was a former tie-in writer doing stuff on an actual Star Trek show kind of lends it a real air of legitimacy, what we do as tie-in writers, And so she came back and said, well, hey, look, we're looking at doing novels. Are you interested? And, well, yeah, obviously. I'm not going to say no to the opportunity to write another Star Trek book, and especially another Star Trek book about a brand new show. And to make it even better, she said, well, we've got this new character, and it's kind of the alien breakout viewpoint character, which is a staple of we always have in Star Trek. We had like characters like Spock or Data or Seven of Nine or the Doctor, or Odo on DS9. We've always had a character, that alien outsider character who gives us a kind of a view of the human condition from the outside in. And this is Saru. This is going to be the guy on Discovery. So obviously I was very enthused about that. But at the very beginning of things, we had to keep everything very, very secret because Paramount and were playing it very, very close to their chest, and we had to be very, very quiet about what we were seeing. So me and the other guys, we were signed up to a top secret VPN. So we were being sent copies of the scripts. Every time a new iteration of the script would come out, we'd get that emailed to us. And each day we would get the photographs coming in from the previous day's filming, so we would see all the set photography. And it was incredible to have that degree of access. Completely unprecedented, I would say, in terms of any tie-in project I've ever worked in, to have that degree of contact, a two-way contact, this street being open between us and the production office, to see the shows literally forming in front of our eyes, reading the script one day, and then the next day going, oh, wow, there's the set photography from that. There's that scene being shot right in front of me, seeing it all come together. And watching the show assemble and the themes of it all coming together. And off the back of that, removed kind of one step away from it, looking at these book ideas and saying, well, how do we take what we're seeing there and evolve that concept into something really interesting? And with Saru, obviously, he plays a very important role in the show, and his arc is quite strong throughout the course of season 1 of Discovery. And having the opportunity to sort of like tackle him and unfold a little bit more of his character was really exciting for me. Especially as, at the beginning of the show, he's kind of a bit one note when you get this idea is, he's from this this predator-filled planet, and he's like a bit of a scaredy cat, and that's the only character note you get. But as he evolves through the story, you know, we see him stepping into a command role and really becoming a fully fleshed out character. So having the opportunity to go, well, who is that guy before he's the guy we see in the first two-part episode? That was a really interesting challenge, and we got to work very closely with Kirsten. Kirsten's kind of like the single point of contact that we had on the show. We worked with her, doing a kind of little back and forth, and just, you know, coming together to create hopefully something that worked really well.
So at what point were you writing this novel? Was it, I mean, obviously you're getting the show notes, but were you still writing the novel when the show premiered, so you were able to see the characters' interaction and the visuals, or was this all written prior to that?
Well, I was pretty lucky, actually, because I was like tail end Charlie of this 3-book set. I got the most amount of time to absorb the show as it was coming out. Dave was at the front of the line, right? He's the first guy, so he had to be working on his novel when the show was still being constructed. Dayton was in the middle of things, so he got a little bit of either way. But I was actually writing, you know, actually properly cutting metal, writing the story on Fear itself as the show was coming out. So I was getting to watch finished versions of episodes, because I already, obviously, I'd seen all the scripts and I'd seen the kind of the prototype versions of the characters, as it were. But, you know, scripts change in the filming, and they change in the editing, and obviously what's on screen is ultimately that's the definition of the character, and that's the definition of the moment and the nuance of them. And I had the position of being able to absorb all of that before I got to deliver the book. But we were right up against the wire. I mean, we pushed to the very limit, to the point that when we were going through the final kind of desk edits, they were already starting to put together ideas. The writers' room had already gathered for season 2, and they were starting to put together ideas about what they were going to do with the second season of the show and with Saru's arc through that. And we were trying to draw from that and say, okay, well, if you're going to be doing that in season 2, this is stuff that we can't do in the book. Or, you know, we want to make sure that we don't do anything that will potentially collide with any ideas that they're putting together for that series. And in fact, Fear itself went through a lot of changes because of that, because of the way the show was evolving. A lot of the decisions that the writing staff on the series made meant that there were certain things that I had planned to do in the book that in the end I couldn't do.
So you've gotten some insights into what's going to happen in season 2, as well as knowing what was going on in season 1 then.
Yeah, I mean, not anywhere near as much. I mean, we haven't been seeing sort of script treatments or anything like that, but we've kind of had a few conversations about it.
Yeah, Dan, don't start asking what's coming up in season 2. He's not going to tell you.
Don't worry, I know better than that.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, the truth is, guys, as I really know about as much as anybody else does. You know, I've been looking at some of the news reports coming through, and the stuff that has been announced. I mean, you know, it's pretty public knowledge that there is going to be a Saru-centric story in episode 2, you know, so my lead at that point was just, you know, don't step on anything that show is going to do.
Excellent. Well, one thing that I really appreciated about this novel was, like you said, kind of getting inside Saru's head and, you know, learning a lot more about him. I love the fact that we get most of this book from his perspective. And I was wondering what it was like kind of getting a grasp on the character and finding that voice that, I mean, because he's got a very unique way of looking at the world. And I was wondering what it was like to craft a story from that perspective.
Well, you know, when I was watching the show, the thing I saw when I was reading people's commentary about the show and, you know, what people's impressions of his character were, I was seeing a lot of people who suffered like kind of social anxiety and kind of like, you know, issues about their sort of like their sense of self. And they were saying that they identified really strongly with the idea that Saru is this guy who's kind of like, you know, he's being pulled in 2 different directions. You know, he has a very strong ego, but he wants to be liked. You know, he wants to be an outgoing character, but he's also quite introverted. And there were a lot of people who had that experience in their lives saying, this character really speaks to me because I see a lot of myself in them. So I tried to reach into that. You know, all of us have had moments where we felt insecure. All of us had moments where, you know, our self-confidence becomes brittle and breaks. And I went back to all of those moments in my own life and thought, well, where can I draw from to find the elements that speak to the character of Saru? So I tried to build a narrative that orbits around that, because this is essentially, Fear itself is essentially a be careful what you wish for story. Because it's about Saru saying, well, you know, I'm good at this job. I could be a command officer. You know, I could deal with this kind of thing. And then that's exactly what gets dropped in his lap. and he gets put in a situation where he has to be a commanding officer, where he has to deal with two warring factions and also kind of earn the respect of the Starfleet crew that he's with. And all these things are all pulling him in different directions. And he basically gets what he asked for and finds he doesn't actually want it, but it's too late. He has to deal with all these situations. And that's an interesting challenge to put a character in, because he's out of his comfort zone. And the truth about Saru is he's never in his comfort zone. All the time we see him, he doesn't have much of a comfort zone of any kind, the poor guy, because of the kind of culture that he comes from and the situation that he's in. He's always slightly afraid of everything around him. And, it's a terrible way to go through life. But people who have that kind of sensibility have to learn how to manage it and how to move through life and not have it be a kind of crippling thing that controls everything that they do. And Saru's going through the same thing. And that was really interesting to tackle that, because we don't often see that in Star Trek. We don't traditionally see characters who have big character issues, who have big flaws that they have to get over. Usually it's someone has an issue and they address it and they deal with it and they move on, they become a better person. Saru is the kind of guy, he's never going to really get past what he is. So he has to learn to kind of make it part of what he is. He has to learn how to make peace with it. And that's what I tried to kind of shine a light on, is how do you deal with that thing if it's not something you can just make go away?
And I think we'll explore this character more as we go through the discussion, but we want to try to avoid some spoilers here in the beginning, and then we get later into this conversation. We'll warn everybody when we get into spoilers, because we do want to delve deep into this book and into the character of Saru. But you had mentioned about the different warring races that are going on with each other. It's, we have Saru that goes on this Polar ship, or Polar. Is it Polar or Polar? How would you?
Peliar.
Peliar. I was off on both of them. The Peliar ship. And he finds that the Gorlans are held in seclusion in this freighter, and that they are an individual. They have this individual being or member of their group that is basically, quote, the hub. And they're being taken to this world to be rid of and relocated and join their other people. Anyway, I don't want to we can go on and on about that, but I would want you to tell us about those two races and how you came up with them. And I would think that maybe there's certain aspects of them that you developed so it would play off of that fear of Saru and that insecurity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's as I said, the story is about Saru being finding himself in a situation which I think is a very traditional Star Trek situation. We often see this ideal in Star Trek narratives of Starfleet being in a circumstance where there are two or more factions in conflict, and our Starfleet characters come into the situation and go, "How can we try and help you people? How can we try and ameliorate this? How can we stop this conflict from happening?" And hopefully by the end of the story, everybody kind of finds a happy medium and, everybody lives happily ever after. That, to me, is a very traditional Star Trek story model. So I thought, well, how can I, take that concept and drop it into the Discovery style of storytelling, which is much more gritty, which is much more flawed, which is much more about characters, trying to find their place in the world. There aren't as many easy answers as maybe there are in other Star Trek stories. And so the way I did that is, I took these two factions, these two species, the Peliar come from an episode of Star Trek Next Generation, and the Gorlans don't even appear on screen, actually, just mentioned in passing in a TOS episode in Mirror Mirror. So I had a pretty big, open space to kind of develop backgrounds for both of these species. And of course, in the Discovery timeline, it's a long time before we've seen any of their sort of the TNG characters' background, and it's before the Gorlans are mentioned. So I had a lot of opportunity to develop stuff and kind of position these characters and these species to perform the narrative roles that I need to have them perform. So I had quite a free hand there, and that was very useful to make the story structure work.
Well, I always appreciate that too, when authors kind of flesh out species that we've heard of or maybe seen briefly in a few episodes, because, there's so much rich stuff in Star Trek and so many things to build on. I really like the Peliar Zell moons. We just see them briefly. I think it's in the episode The Host, if I'm not mistaken. And just to get a little bit of background even adds a little bit more context to those episodes.
Yeah, I mean, it was there's a lot, like you say, there's a lot of kind of throwaway species that you see in one episode and you never hear of those guys ever again. And the thing about the Discovery time period is we have to be very careful about who we use in a story because of continuity issues. You know, you don't want a species turning up and saying like, well, we're having a conversation with some Bajorans. It's like, well, did we meet the Bajorans at this point in time? You know, can we talk to a Cardassian, or is, you know, Cardassians aren't around yet? Can we talk to this species? Can we talk to that species? Yeah. So I had to, you know, look through the timeline and go, well, who's available for me to tell stories about? Who has enough empty backstory that I can pour new narrative ideas into? And these guys were both perfect fits for that. And having the fact that the Peliars had turned up on screen, so I had kind of something visual to work from. I had you know, a concept I could draw from. And with the Gorlans having more of a free hand there, I decided I was going to create a species who look a little bit different. So these guys are kind of like stocky, almost kind of Lord of the Rings dwarf type guys, except they have 4 arms, which is something we'd never seen on Star Trek before. And I thought that might be interesting to have a creature with, you know, different number of limbs, which immediately kind of creates a very striking visual image. And having them be sort of like short, stocky little guys, and Saru being tall and gangly, immediately to me creates a very arresting kind of visual image of these guys having a conversation.
And the use of the Tholians as well, I feel like they're kind of a species we don't get a lot of insight into. And I feel like in this book, you kind of delve a little bit into their mindset and how they see the people around them. At this point, how much contact did you imagine the Federation had with the Tholians? And I mean, I know we do see them in Enterprise a little bit, but has there been a lot of history between them, or is this kind of one of the first real face-offs between them?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I always liked the Tholians, you know, from their first appearance in TOS, where we just kind of get the glimpse of them, and they have this, you know, they're super mysterious, and the idea of them being the crystalline-based life form, you know, they're probably one of Trek's truly alien aliens, and I really, really like that about them. And then seeing them again in Enterprise was fun. So when I was looking for a threat force for this story, I was looking and saying, well, it can't be the Romulans because of the time period, and it can't really be the Klingons because of what's going to happen in Battle for the Binary Stars. It needs to be somebody else. And I thought for a while, do I want to create a new aggressor species? And I kept going back and thinking, I really want to kind of tie this more closely to the continuity of the series. And I just really like the Tholians, and I've never really had the opportunity to tackle a story with them in it. So when we were putting the story together, I went to Margaret Clark, who was editing the book, and I said, how about the Tholians? What do you think? And that went back to Discovery HQ, and they said, like, yeah, you know, we don't have any plans to do anything with them in the first season. So, you know, make the Tholians the bad guys in this story. In terms of the greater continuity of where they fit in the timeline, I just had the sense that things haven't really changed much between this period and, you know, when we see them in the Tholian web. Is that they've just, I imagine there's some point where, you know, Starfleet's kind of stepped on their toes and they've said, don't, you know, this is our fence, don't cross it. And if you do, you know, there'll be trouble. And there is kind of a sense of almost the escalation going on in this story. You know, there is a confrontation at the end of the novel where, you know, the Tholians are confronted, and they quite clearly say, you know, if you step over our line in the sand, it's going to go badly for you. But they don't give anything back. You know, they're completely unreasonable. They have this xenophobic, you know, totally acerbic, unpleasant attitude. They're not interested in being friends with anyone. They just want, you know, you stay on your side, and we'll stay on our side. But beneath that, bubbling away, I think, is this kind of territorial nature that they want to expand their turf, and they don't really care about anybody else. There's something that Dan Abnett, a friend of mine who worked on the Warhammer novels with me, but he wrote some great Star Trek comics. He did this with his Pike-era Star Trek comics, the early Voyages ones. He did a story that had the Tholians in it, and he hit on the idea that the Tholians have flexible borders. And because of the way that they see space-time and they see kind of territory, as it were, those borders are not like literally lines on a map, because they move backwards and forwards. So from their point of view, where they think the line is drawn is not necessarily where you think the line is drawn. And they're perfectly justified in attacking you. And I like the idea of that because, again, that plays into their alien nature, because, you know, they perceive the nature of the universe in a more alien way than, say, you know, a humanoid species might. And I think all of that is kind of bubbling away under the surface of the Tholians when they appear in this novel.
I love that, because you're right. we look at things a certain way, and that's what makes different aliens seem so alien to us, because the way they view things is totally different. I didn't even, I would have never thought of that. I just would think, when we talk territory, everybody thinks of the same way. You put lines on a map, and theirs is always changing. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite interesting. But also with the Gorlans, I'd like to talk a little bit about, I guess it's Ela, the hub.
Ija.
Yeah. So Ija, tell us about that character and how you came up with that, because I find that really interesting how that society works.
Well, what I wanted to do is create a culture that when you first meet them, you think they're quite primitive, but they're not really. Because I like the idea of that. It's something that you see. It's touched on a little bit if you watch, in Star Trek Insurrection, when they go down to the planet and they meet these people who don't have technology and they live in these nice kind of houses and everything. And it's like, oh, these people are kind of primitive and low tech. And it turns out that actually no, they understand how warp drive works. They're just not interested in using it. And I didn't really like those guys in Insurrection, to be honest. I thought they were very sort of haughty and a bit arrogant. But I liked the idea of encountering a species and thinking these people are primitive. These people are not as sophisticated as us because they live in tents and they don't have toasters or replicators or a car, right? And I thought that's a very interesting idea to me, to find out that that's not true. Is that these people just have, again, it's about perception, right? These people have a way of life that just because it isn't quote unquote sophisticated, it's not primitive. It's just different. And that's kind of the direction I wanted to take with the Gorlans. So when our characters first encounter them, they have an issue communicating with them because their language is really complex, and it has a kind of strange nuance which is based on the idea that their bodies broadcast an electromagnetic field. So there's this invisible component to their communication, and if you can't sense that, you can't even really have a proper conversation with these people because you can't get the nuance of what they're saying. And again, it's about a level of sophistication in their culture that is not immediately apparent to the eye. So I wanted to develop that idea. And then the concept that because they have this sort of shared aura, for want of a better term, that all the different people, can sense each other's emotional states, that they have this sense of community. It's not like a group mind. It's not like a Borg-style collective kind of thing where, their thoughts, they're transferring literal thoughts. It's more subtle than that. And the idea that the hub is somebody who's born into this culture, who is kind of slightly stronger in this ability, this sort of, it's not even a psychic ability, it's this sort of energetic transmission. And that person can kind of, in some sort of way, bring a sense of unity, a sense of community to this group, and allow people to kind of work to a shared purpose. But it's not like mind control. And I was trying to find a way to how could I do something, how could I have the idea of an alien collective that isn't based on coercion, but based on unity and community.
Yeah, and I felt that species was really fascinating. Like you said, the initial kind of stilted way they have of communicating to the perspective of outsiders because they don't have that translation ability. And then, Saru kind of cluing in that it's this electromagnetic field. I thought that was really great. And it reminded me a little bit, I want to say, of like the Packleds or something like that. But then we find out, of course, they're much more sophisticated and communicate and have a really interesting society. And the hub, for example, her whole nature, I think, is really fascinating with her kind of stunted physical growth. But at the same time, she has a lot of mental prowess. And I guess maybe at this point, do we want to start getting into spoilers?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect place.
Okay, yeah. So this point forward, we're getting into spoilers. If you haven't read the book, listen with care. Maybe go read the book because it really is worth it. You should pick it up. It's excellent.
Right, we're pulling the spoiler chain now.
Yes.
So yeah, and the hub's ability also, in a limited manner, to kind of predict the future, I thought was a really interesting take. And the fact that it's more of a just recognizing patterns, I thought was really cool. When did that kind of come into the story, that idea of her ability to do that?
Well, I wanted to create, like I said, I wanted the whole idea narratively, dramatically speaking, of the Gorlan is to create a species that you think is one thing when you first encounter them, and then you realize that there's layer after layer after layer. And so this was all about Saru's kind of discovery, if you will, through this story. Is Saru's personal journey of discovery with these guys is learning about who they are. And I think that's a very Star Trek, very Starfleet thing to do, is, he's unpicking the layers of what the Gorlan are, getting past his own preconceptions, and also the preconceptions of the Peliar-Zel characters, who have just seen the surface and said, these people are primitives, and and we're in a situation where because they're primitives, because we're more sophisticated, quote unquote, and smarter than them, we can pretty much treat them any way we like. Whereas Saru's the guy who's saying, well, maybe there's more to this, maybe there's more to how all of this works. And once he drills down into that, he discovers that they have this unification, this aura sense that kind of allows them to have a sense of community. And Ija the Hub, she is the kind of the exemplar of this. She's almost like this kind of quasi-religious sort of leader. I was imagining someone who's just got this kind of Dalai Lama kind of golden child kind of thing going on, where there are somebody who represents like the spiritual center of these people, someone who can kind of help them find peace and direction in their lives. And the idea is that she is kind of, although she's kind of physically withered, the idea is that evolution has kind of said, well, if her body is kind of weak, her mind has become stronger. And what she has is this kind of almost subconscious ability to see the patterns in things and understand what's going to happen. So it's not like she's literally precognitive and she's seeing visions of the future. It's more that her brain is kind of seeing all of these possibilities and saying, if we go down this path, these are the things that are going to happen. So she's not able to kind of say, this is exactly what's going to happen, but she has a kind of vague sense of it. And that's what she's trying to communicate to Saru, is that, we're on a path that's going to take us to a dark place, and I need your help to help us bring things back before terrible things happen to all of us.
Yeah, and Saru really starts to step up. But before we get even into that, one of the things I also want to discuss is the relationship that Saru has with Burnham. When he's off the Shenzhou, Captain Georgiou sends Burnham to Saru's cabin because Burnham and Saru have that's the relationship that Saru has a closer bond with, is with Burnham, which is surprising because it's not that close. He's very standoffish. He's very private. He doesn't really get to know people and have a relationship with the rest of the crew. So Burnham then goes into his cabin to figure out just finding clues to explain why Saru was doing what he's doing on the Peliar ship. And she begins to learn that he's pushing himself without realizing what he's getting himself into. And he's trying to be more like her. And I'd like you to just kind of explain that whole thought pattern you're having in that relationship between Saru and Burnham and his thoughts about her.
Sure. I got to say, that's one of my favorite bits of this book, was to write those two characters. I really enjoyed kind of getting right into the weeds of that relationship. Because when I was lucky enough that I got to go to the writer's room and sit in on a day and have a chat to the writers while the show was being put together when I was out in Los Angeles last year. And Kirsten very kindly, set me up in her office in front of her laptop and gave me a couple of early cuts of the first 2 or 3 episodes to watch. And when I was done, I got to sit in the lunch break in the writer's room and chat to sort of 3 or 4 of the writers. They, sat me down there with a bottle of Mountain Dew and a toasted cheese sandwich. And I said, okay, guys, I've got all these questions I want to talk to you about. And I threw them all out there and I was chatting away. And the thing that I found myself most enthused about from reading these scripts and from watching the early episodes was that Burnham-Saru dynamic. Is they have this really interesting adversarial relationship. And it's a kind of adversarial relationship that we haven't really seen on Star Trek before. You get a little bit of it when you look at like the Spock-McCoy relationship, is that there is that kind of, there's respect. Is they both realize, you're pretty good at your job. But there's also a kind of sense of, I don't quite like you, but I'm not really, but it could go the other way. And it was encapsulated really well to me at the end of a conversation I had with Kirsten. She said, the relationship between Saru and Burnham is, at this point, it's the seed that never gets any water. And I thought, that's a really great way of putting it. That's the kernel of that relationship, is that they could be good friends right now in this part of the story, but they're not, because both of them are the people that they are. But you can see the idea that at some future point, and of course we see that in Discovery as the show starts to evolve, that there is the possibility these two people can become friends. But in Fear itself, this is 4 years before that happens, and they are definitely not at that place yet. But I wanted to lay that in. I wanted to kind of lay a little bit of the keel of that relationship and say you can just about see where it could go. If things went a different way, they could be best buddies, but that's not going to happen for quite a while yet. And so trying to find a way to explore that was, setting them up at the beginning of the novel where they're both dealing with this particular assignment they're working on, and they're both pulling at it from different directions, and they have this kind of, sniping kind of conversation that they're going through, and he's like, I want to do it this way, no, I want to do it this way, and they're butting heads all the way through it. And then when Saru gets involved in the situation on the Pelyazel ship and he's no longer there, his relationship with the rest of the crew, with everybody else except Burnham, is thrown into very stark relief. Because as you say, because he's an introverted character, he hasn't really made a lot of friends. And in a sad kind of way, Burnham's the closest thing to a friend that he actually has. And the truth is they have this kind of quite negative relationship. And it's a little bit sad, when you think, he doesn't really have anybody that he can kind of hang out with in 10 Forward, as it were. And because she's a xenoethnologist, the part of Burnham that is interested in the nature of alien species is immediately intrigued by Saru, because she wants to know more about who he is. The scientist in her wants to know, tell me more about the Kelpian species, tell me more about you. But he's not opening up to her. So when she gets the opportunity to basically sneak around in his quarters and kind of peer in his underwear drawer, she takes it. Even if I think on some level she kind of feels a bit guilty about it, the other part of her that's saying, well, it'd be interesting to find out more about him, she jumps at the opportunity.
I feel like she's always studying him, and she's always testing him, and not really teasing him, but she puts him in situations where she just wants to see how he reacts. I've seen that in the show, and then also in your book. It's a very interesting relationship between these two, because they're not close, but like you said, this is the closest relationship he has with anyone, and they've served together for years. And I feel like there's very much a respect between the two characters, but it's really very shallow, the different aspects of the relationship that comes into play outside of respect.
Yeah, I mean, that whole thing about Burnham having that kind of testing mindset, that's definitely something I saw on the show, and I do deliberately echo that in their relationship in this book. And I think that comes from her personal baggage, which is, being a human-raised Vulcan. You look at what we see of Burnham's life, and she very clearly went through that in every step of her life. She was constantly being tested all the time, not just by, Sarek saying, here's a maths problem for you to solve, but she was subconsciously being tested by the fact that living in an alien culture and being tested, because to be Vulcan, she's constantly being tested in that. And I think that to her is almost something she's assimilated into the way that you behave with people, is that she tests Saru, she tests the people around her. You look at her relationship with Captain Georgiou at the beginning of the show, in the first couple of episodes. You can see her even doing that with her mentor figure, kind of testing what's going on around her, testing the boundaries. Even with Tyler later on, there's always that element of her pushing and testing and kind of pulling on that element. And I think that comes down to the way she was raised. So that definitely plays into the relationship that she has with Saru. And Saru is also testing himself, because he's somebody who's, pushing against his own nature, trying to be better than he is. And that is a thing that they both share, which I think for quite a while, that neither of them realize that they have that very strong point of commonality. But it's something that Georgiou sees, and she knows that they're both driven in this fashion. And it's part of the reason why, in the story, Saru kind of looks at the way that Burnham is doing stuff and says, well, I'm gonna try the Michael Burnham approach, and it blows up in his face. And it's exactly the wrong choice to make at this critical moment. And he does exactly the wrong thing, and everything goes horribly wrong. And then he has to kind of figure out, wait a minute, what I should have done is I should have made the Saru choice. How do I get back to where that is? And later on, that's something that Georgiou picks up on. And she says, I don't want you to be like Michael Burnham. I don't want Burnham to be like you. I want you to be you and her to be her, because I want the strengths that both of you are going to bring. I don't want the same thing repeated.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite lines where she says, I need a Michael Burnham and I need a Saru. And I thought that was just encapsulated that whole dynamic really perfectly.
Yeah, because I mean, Georgiou is to me this quintessential mentor character. I think I got a lot of love for Michelle. Yeah, I've loved her as an actress from ages back. Plus just watching her kick ass in Jackie Chan movies. I mean, what's not to love, right? But she brings this kind of real sense of kind of grace and intellect and sort of soft power to that role. And I really, really loved that. And that was another reason I was so happy to be able to do a book set before the battle of the binary stars, so I could actually do some Georgiou scenes as well. And I think she encapsulates that idea of the mentor who is just trying to nurture these people. I know she's looking at these characters and saying, I can make you the best officers you can be. I'm just opening the door and helping you find the way to being your best possible self.
So this novel, possibly very obviously, is centered around the idea of fear. I mean, we've got the title Fear itself. We've got the character Saru, who is just very naturally driven by fear. Where he comes from, that's the fundamental thing that keeps them alive, is this awareness of their surroundings and a fear of this predator species on their planet. But interestingly to me, by the end of this novel, I really feel that Saru is showing a lot more courage than any other character. So we get a lot of other examples. For example, the military officer that comes in the Peliar carrier. He's a big blustering military type, but when it comes down to it, he shows a lot of fear, and that drives him, and he acts on that. Whereas Saru is constantly being bombarded by these feelings of fear. But he's able to overcome it, and he's constantly pushing against that, which almost to me makes him show more courage than anyone else in this book.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is it they always say is that courage is being afraid and doing it anyway,
right? Yeah.
Right? And that's what Saru's doing right there. The character you're talking about, Tor, the military officer, he comes in this bellicose, swaggering, shouty guy, kind of laying down the law and everything. But underneath that all, he's terrified of the Tholians. Absolutely, absolutely terrified of this, unknowable, scary alien force. And rightly so, of course. He's completely right to be afraid of them. But what he's doing is he's externalizing that. Is instead of kind of taking that inside and dealing with it in a way that maybe a more kind of grounded person would be, he's externalizing his fear of them and turning it into anger against everybody else.
So I guess my question then is, tell us where Saru is at the beginning of this book and where Saru is at the end of this book.
That's a good question. I think at the beginning of the book, he thinks he's ready. He thinks he's ready for command. He's a bit resentful of Burnham because he's got this. I describe him in the story as like having this flat, steady career trajectory. He's the tortoise, she's the hare, right? He's plodding his way on and he's doing what he needs to do and he's doing everything right, but he's doing it at this slow, steady pace. He's not a rock star, right? He's just like, I'm doing my job. I'm a consistent, steady guy. And then suddenly in his rearview mirror, what does he see? Burnham racing up through the command ranks. Everybody thinks she's cool, and so he's a bit resentful of her because he knows she's going to overstep him. She's going to end up being promoted above him. And of course, we know that's exactly what does happen. And so he's at the beginning point of the story, he's thinking, I could be doing, why does everybody like her so much? I can do her job. I could be a first officer. I could be a captain. And he's absolutely believes all of that. And because he has this sort of sense of resentment, he doesn't really have a moment where he can look inward and go, is that really true? Am I really ready for this? And because he has this moment of arrogance, he gets himself into a situation and it all goes horribly wrong. And his arrogance is shown to him. It's like, you helped make this bad thing happen. Now you've got to sort it out. And so by the end of the story, I think he's humbled a little bit. He realizes that he made a mistake and, he comes back and he kind of takes it on the chin, which is a mature adult thing to do. He doesn't try to shy away from it. He doesn't try and put the blame on somebody else. He basically says, I made this mistake. I'm going to own it and I'm going to become a better person for it. I'm going to learn from the error that I made. And by the end of the story, he's taken that on board and hopefully he's kind of moved forward in his sense of self and understanding himself a little bit better, and maybe, going, okay, well, I won't make that mistake again. I'm not going to have that kind of level of arrogance. I mean, he still does a little bit. He hasn't solved all of his problems by the end of the story, but he has made this incremental step forward in who he is and coming to understand the nature of himself, learning to live with his flaws and, his more negative character traits.
So when you approach the character, knowing what you've seen in the TV series, you almost have to backtrack and maybe make him a little more fearful or whatever, so he can learn this lesson to be where we see him in Discovery.
Yeah, it's exactly that. That's the thing whenever you're writing a prequel, you have to kind of take the character and go, okay, well, just wind it back, dial it backwards a little bit. This is similar to what I did back when I was writing Day of the Vipers for the Terracnor DS9 stories. One of the main characters that appears in that is a young Gul Dukat, who's not even a Gull at that point. And I had to look at who he was in Deep Space Nine and say, okay, well, who is this guy 30 years before that? He has to recognizably be that person, but also has to have character traits that he will grow out of and change. I mean, this is only 4 years before we see Saru for the very first time on the TV show, so he's not changed that much. But he has to change noticeably. And I think the lesson that Saru comes away with at the end of Fear itself is, make some friends. Be a bit, don't be so closed off. And we see that at the end when he kind of offers the sort of olive branch to Burnham and says, like, well, maybe we can kind of hang out together and maybe not quite be so combative in our relationship. But then 4 years later, we see that they still do have that kind of spikiness going on. So it goes back to the Kirsten statement about the seed that doesn't get any water, is that, he does make a step forward, but not enough that everything's solved and everything's perfect by the end of the story.
Yeah. And what a great sandbox to also play in, that you had to, you could develop the other crew members of the Shenzhou that we don't get to see that much on the show.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff had already been done by Dave Mack, because early on we didn't have like a series Bible for the show to work from. So this is something that Dave did back when him and Dayton and Kevin Dillmore were working on Vanguard, is develop the idea of a shared kind of writer's Bible. So we started putting together this kind of shared document that we all had. And as the new episode scripts were coming out, we would add stuff to it, subtract things to it. And that was where, we came up with all the character names. So, and that was one of the great things, talked about the to and fro between the books and the series is, they didn't have first names for the characters for a lot of the bridge crew. And so those were ones that, the book writing team helped to create and said, well, if you don't have a name for Detmer, well, her first name is Kayla. And it's like, okay, that's Kayla Detmer. And now that's like folded back into sort of the canonicity of the show, which is really kind of cool. And I did a lot of development work on Saru's backstory and also on the backstory of the Kelpiens. Is at one point, in the very early iteration of the novel, back then the book was actually called Danger Zone, because we were going to have, all the books were going to have a 2-word title starting with a D word. Obviously, there weren't that many Kenny Loggins fans though at Papa Books, so we changed it. We changed it to Fear Itself, which I think is a much better title, to be honest. I think it homes more closely to what the story's about. But yeah, so early on, a very early iteration of the story was going to be 2 parallel plot lines. And the first one was going to be Saru dealing with a situation kind of in the present day. But the other storyline was going to be the origin story for Saru. It was going to talk about, how he left his home planet and what the reasons were and how he became involved with Starfleet. And a lot of that involved me developing an entire culture and backstory for the Kelpiens. And I remember when Kirsten said to me, we want you to do this. And I said, are you quite sure? Because that's a pretty big deal for this character. You're really sure you want me to do that in a book? Because this is something that, you should probably do on the TV show. And it's like, well, we're not really sure. And I said, well, I remember asking like 2 or 3 times, are you quite sure you want me to do this? Because absolutely, I'll leap at the opportunity, but it seems like it would be better for the series. And she said, no, go for it. So I did. And then as time went on, I think because Saru became, in the making of the first season, people, I think, realized that Saru was becoming this breakout character. He had that depth of interest and, there was a lot of room for him to grow and change and have more of his character unfolded on the show. In the end, they said, actually, you know what, we're going to do it on the show. And I said, yeah, I'm not surprised. So I wrote a bunch of stuff. Which went into our writer's guide, and that went to the writer's room. I have no idea how much if any of it will appear if they eventually do the kind of Saru goes back to his home planet episode, his Amok time episode, right? If they do an episode like, I don't know how much, if any, they'll use. We'll see. It'll be interesting to see what take the writers' room have on it. I think it's going to be fascinating it's a really interesting team of writers there, and to see what kind of spin they're going to put on Saru's origin story. So I touch on it a little bit, just very briefly, talking about how he left his home planet, and it was like kind of Starfleet offered him an opportunity to do something interesting, and he took it. And of course, this is the Fear itself is the first place where you actually see the name of Saru's homeworld mentioned, which is Kaminar, and that was we had a few different names about that, and then right at the very end, they were like, okay, we're going to put this in. This is something that's going to be in the script. We're going to put this into the book. So I was really pleased to kind of have that little tidbit of information unveiled in the novel. Again, getting to connect back to the evolving show as it went forward.
That's really cool, because it makes your story even just that much more meaningful, that it can be tied so closely to what they're doing on the show.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it comes back to that point I made earlier on when I said about how happy we were when Kirsten became a writer on a TV show. I think all of us writing the books did feel like this lends a legitimacy to what we do as tie-in writers, because there are fans out there who don't go for the tie-in stuff, who don't read the books, don't look at the comics, don't play the games, who see that kind of ancillary material as, oh, it's not kind of proper Star Trek, it's not, it doesn't count, it's not canonical, it's not this, it's not that. To which I say, well, more for you, because you're missing out on a bunch of really cool stories. But I think, some of what we're doing, I mean, are these books, this is a question I've heard a lot. A lot of people say to me, are these books canonical? Is this official? Is everything that happens in these Discovery novels totally, absolutely part of that universe? And the answer is, well, kinda. It's kind of soft canon, right? It's like, if I write something in Fear itself and the script writers go, this is a cool idea, and they use it, then it's canonical. And if they look at it and go, actually, we have an idea about how we could do that a bit better and a bit differently, then it kind of becomes non-canonical. And I'm sanguine about the whole idea, because we write these stories, but we serve at the pleasure of the show, because the show is the primary lead, and if it's in the show, if it's on the screen, that trumps what's on the page. And as a tie-in writer, you have to understand that. And if you have a problem with it, then maybe being a tie-in writer is not the right job for you. I accept that, and I'm happy just to get an opportunity to kind of play in the sandbox for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of always been our line on Literary Treks as well, is, if you're not reading the novels, you're missing out on some really great stories. And up until Discovery came along, it was the source for prime timeline new Star Trek. So, I mean, you guys have been doing a lot of really important work, I think, for the Star Trek universe. And, whether or not something ends up being canon or not, to me, it's always, that's something for the writers of the show to worry about. For us, let's just enjoy Star Trek stories. That's kind of always been my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading Trek novels since, well, let me see. What was the first Trek novel? I would say, if I don't count like novelizations, I mean, I think probably the James Blish episode novelizations were probably like the first Trek books I ever read. But the first Trek, like proper tie-in, original story I ever read was Vonda McIntyre's The Entropy Effect. I remember a friend of mine, I was a member of a Star Trek fan club, and a friend of mine who was running it, my friend Kathy, said to me, hey, have you read this? This is really cool. This is like an original Star Trek novel. It's like, wow, what, more Star Trek? I didn't know there was more stuff, because you read the novelizations and you're like, oh, that's kind of cool, but it's a show I've already seen. It's like, no, here's a completely new original story. Here's new stuff for you to take in. Why would you not want to be interested in that? And the thing is looking back at that particular book, right, with the, Sulu with long hair and a beard and all that kind of thing that was going on in there, and all these little interesting bits and pieces. Does that dovetail with other bits of Star Trek? Well, no, but it's, I can kind of hold those two different versions of it in my head at once and not be confused and angry about it. And I'm always a little bit, I don't get people who say, well, it doesn't all match up in complete exacting detail, therefore it's wrong. And to me, I go, it's not wrong, it's just different. You can accept two different things side by side.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I watched a Marvel movie and it doesn't fit in exactly to that same Marvel comic perfectly, so it's just a different version.
Man, I mean, if you're a comics fan, I mean, forget continuity, right? I mean, is there any? I don't think there's any comics that exist that maybe keep all of their continuity together. I mean, I guess there must be some out there somewhere, but yeah, I mean, if you like Marvel or DC, if you're a superhero comics nerd, you learn to live with that idea from the get-go.
Well, in Star Trek, it's easy too. You can just explain, well, yeah, it takes place in the prime timeline. If something doesn't match up, then someone messed with the timeline at some point, I guess, or it spun off into this is a different alternate universe. I mean, we can make it all work.
Are people still saying that Discovery isn't in the prime timeline? Is that still a thing? I hope it isn't.
I don't hear it that often, but occasionally I do.
Yeah, there's a recent comment on one of my YouTube videos just this morning that, it's in the Kelvin timeline, but I'm like, okay, whatever.
Once my Fear itself was officially announced, I did have people sending me messages going, it's not in the prime timeline. I was like, yeah, it kind of is. Sorry, don't agree with you there. It's like, by all means, you can have your opinion about it, but it says Star Trek on it, so it's prime timeline. Sorry.
Yep, absolutely. Well, kind of something I wanted to bring up. And this is kind of a sensitive subject because we're not getting a lot of Star Trek novel releases this year. I'm wondering if you've heard any progress on these pocketbook CBS negotiations that we keep being told is right around the corner here. Do you know of any plans for new novels coming soon?
I gotta be really careful what I say now. I've heard some things I can't say any more about. The problem with this is because all of this stuff is happening kind of behind the scenes, and this is all corporate machinations, and it's people in boardrooms who have frankly no interest in what it is that we're interested in. This stuff just doesn't trickle down to us, and so they'll be like, well, we'll tell you when we tell you. They don't really care about us writers or editors or readers about what we're thinking about. They're talking about dollars and cents and bottom lines, right? So those negotiations are ongoing. I've heard different reasons about why things have been taking so long. I think I've heard people say that there are certain contractual elements that were in conflict, and there were certain things that one group wanted to do that other groups didn't want to do. I don't know how much of that is true. So that's the part of the reason why things are taking so long. And I've been told the same things that you guys have, is that, that an official response is just around the corner. And I've been hearing it for a while. And frankly, I'm as frustrated about it as you are, obviously, because, I want to continue to write Star Trek novels. So not just as somebody who's reading Star Trek books, but as somebody who's working, in that auspice, I want to know, am I going to be able to write a Star Trek novel and, next year? How's it going to go? I tell you what I personally believe. I think, I think things are going to go back to the status quo. I don't see a reason why things would change. I think CBS would be foolish to give the license wholesale to somebody else unless they had a fantastic idea. I think that, the Star Trek books we've been getting over the past few years have been just really strong. And I don't see a reason for that going away. But you could argue that I am being a little self-serving there. And I guess, yeah, I probably am. I admit, I'll take that on the chin. But I think, we've got a good thing going here, and I don't see why, certainly if I was in charge, I wouldn't want to change things. So I hope, just as everybody else does, that we will get an answer soon, that we will get, a definitive answer about what's going forward. I think I've seen a lot of people saying online, oh, this is the end of Star Trek books as we know it. There's going to be a kind of Star Wars EU style bloodbath where everything's going to be thrown out and chucked onto the fire, and that's going to be the end of it. Or there won't ever be any more Star Trek books ever again, or there will only be Discovery books, or there'll only be this. I would be surprised if that sort of thing happened, because Star Trek is a strong brand. There's an obvious demonstrative audience out there. You guys wouldn't be doing a podcast like this if there wasn't a strong audience for people who want to read these books. I think we will see more of them. I would certainly like to write more. I would love to come back and do another Discovery novel. I have an idea kicking around. I'd like to do another Titan novel at some point. Star Trek is such an embarrassment of riches. There's so much out there in the universe, so many stories for us to tell. Even with years of TV shows and movies and comics and books and other stuff, there's still so many stories that we can tell, so many great characters. And I don't think anybody wants to see that stop happening in the books and comics anytime soon.
Yeah, I'm confident that we will get something at some point. It's just a matter of when. But there's definitely going to be more Star Trek books coming sometime in the future.
I mean, I guess we've got the Las Vegas convention coming up soon, haven't we?
Yes.
Mhm.
Right. So, I mean, I'm not saying this because I know anything, but I'm thinking if maybe that'll be the point when eventually we'll get like some sort of official answer, because that'll be like the big official event.
Well, and it could be, and this whole conversation could be mute anyway, because by the time this episode releases, maybe an announcement has already come out.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, yeah, I hope so, and I want to see sort of like more cool stuff coming out. It's been interesting as well, because there's not just the pocketbook Star Trek stuff. We've also been seeing a lot of really interesting Trek works coming out from different publishers. I just picked up today The Root of All Rage, the second Star Trek Prometheus novel.
Yeah.
Yes, we reviewed that on our last episode.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that one actually. So that that's a really fascinating idea to me. Is the idea of our German friends, the guys who translate my novels for the German market, is like bringing a completely new cast of characters and seeing a totally new spin-off Star Trek series. That's been really fascinating for me to read. And then we've got stuff like the the autobiography series. I picked up I haven't read it yet. I got the autobiography of James T. Kirk, because I was thinking, I was like, do I want to read this? Is this, what kind of book is this really? I wasn't sure if it was, how does it's like, it's factual fiction, fictional facts. It's like the idea of an autobiography of a fictional character just kind of struck me as a little weird. But I'd read, is it David Goodman, isn't it? I'd read his the Federation First 150 Years, and I really enjoyed that. And then I was in a bookstore looking around for something, and there was a hardcover copy of the Kirk autobiography, and I thought, yeah, you know what, I'm going to just give this a go and just try it out. So I'm looking forward to reading that.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, even with this pocket books kind of on pause at the moment, there's a lot of really great stuff out there, like you said. So, and yeah, I'm not going to lie, the fact that this episode comes out 2 weeks after we record it, I'm kind of hoping that it's going to jinx the universe and we'll get an announcement before it actually comes out. So, but the listeners out there will be able to know if that's true or not. But
yeah, you'll be getting messages going, you guys got it wrong. It was this all along.
Exactly.
They'll just be laughing at us as they listen to this.
Those poor fools. Little did they realize, Yeah, they're going to announce that what happens after this point is like, it's going to be, from now on, Star Trek publishing is going to be all crayon and coloring book publishing. Dot to dot books and crossword puzzles. That's all we're going to be doing from this point onward. What was it? My buddy Dayton Ward said that we're doing nothing but rom-coms from this point forward. I think that was his idea.
Oh wow, yeah, that's going to change our show a little bit.
I'd still read. Awesome. Well, obviously, nothing Star Trek related in the pocket books universe on the horizon from you coming up. But is there anything else that you've kind of got on the go that our listeners might be interested in?
I'm so glad you asked. I've had a really packed month. Actually, I had 2 book launches almost back to back. So just before Fear Itself came out, the 3rd book in my Mark Dane action thriller series, Ghost, came out in hardback in the UK, and that's been doing really well, and I'm very, very pleased with that. That is sort of set in the present day. It's kind of action adventure, Bourne Identity, Mission Impossible style kind of thriller. So Ghost is the 3rd one in the series, and as I say, that's out in hardback right now, and export trade paperback, ebook, and audio edition. And the 1st book in that series, Nomad, is going to be coming out in the US market in September. Tor Forge Books are going to be publishing that. And my old friend Marco Palmieri from Star Trek days back in Europe, he was the guy who very kindly brought me into the US market there. So I'm hoping that my American readers will finally get a chance to read some of my thriller books. And beyond that, I'm working on a couple of video game projects, doing a little bit of work on The Division 2, which just got announced at E3 this weekend, and a couple other titles that are in the hopper that I can't talk about right now. And I have some other book projects which I'm hoping to announce in the next 2 to 3 months. But things are sort of, once again, some of this stuff's under NDA, so I have to be careful what I say about it.
Awesome. And is there anywhere online that people can follow you and kind of keep up to date on what you've got coming out?
Well, the best place to track me down is I always waste way too much time hanging out on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Trying to be funny and posting stuff, pictures of interesting clouds or jokes, cat videos, that kind of thing. So you can find me on Twitter at JMSwallow. And alternatively, if you want to read some of my blog postings, you can find me on jamesswallow.blogspot.com, my red flag blog, which I try to update as frequently as I can. Talk about my writing and my books and all the new stuff that's coming out.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think I hopefully speak for both Bruce and I when I say this was a really excellent novel. And I actually really enjoyed the 2 previous Discovery novels, but I think this one is my favorite of the 3 so far. So really great novel and a really great exploration of really a favorite character of mine.
Oh, thank you, Dan. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. And I even picked up on the little Easter egg with Ija, the hub, seeing into the future. It looks like she's seeing Saru on the planet of Pavo in the Discovery series. It sounded like that.
Good catch there, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. This is another thing that came out of me being able to be the last guy writing the series. Obviously, by the time I was done, the entire series had aired. So I got to go back and sort of say, well, are there any places where I can kind of, prefigure and foreshadow stuff? So yes, that's very deliberate. That little moment I added at the end where she's kind of seeing him go that way and saying, you're going to go to this place, and she's talking about Pavo, that you're going to go to this place and you're going to think all of your problems are solved, and it will be fake. Don't fall for it. But yeah, there's a bunch of little Easter eggs in there. There's as well as the that reference to Discovery. There's the TNG reference with the Peliar, and the TOS reference with the Gorlans. There's also a little reference in there to Charlie X, which I picked up on, is when I was doing the timeline for this story, because it's set in 2552. I looked around at the Star Trek timeline to see, well, what else happened in that year? And that's the year that Charlie X and his family go missing. So there's a little nod to that in the book as well, and a couple other little references here and there. But yeah, it was I love doing that kind of stuff. You put those little kind of kisses with history in there, and it's, if you're a really sort of hardcore Star Trek nerd, you go, oh, I get that reference.
And that would be us.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's in there for you guys. I did it all for you.
Well, great. Well, thanks again for joining us, and we hope to have you back soon with a new Star Trek book someday.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, guys. My pleasure to be here.
So it was great to have James on, but it's so great to get these novels from these guys in Discovery, because they're all prequels to the original series, but at the same time, they're self-contained stories. So when we watch the TV show, it's this overarching storyline that goes several episodes. Well, when you get to the novel, it almost feels like more of the traditional Star Trek episodes where it's all self-contained.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I love that this one is set aboard the Shenzhou, because I love that dynamic, and we only got a little bit of that on the show. But another thing that I didn't mention during the interview that I wanted to bring up was, the first 2 novels, I really did love them. And they have these really cool connections to Kirk and some, other things from the original series and that sort of thing. But this one, I feel, is the first one that really stands on its own. And it's pretty much just Discovery characters doing their thing and going through this story. There's no like, oh, the Enterprise shows up, Captain April's here, or there's a young Jim Kirk or something like that. So, it just goes to show that, this show and this series can stand on its own and craft just a really terrific story that is a lot of fun to read.
Yeah, it's fun getting those connections to TOS and the other novels, but you don't want that in every novel. It gets to be expected and it's just repetitive. And so, yeah, this was nice. It really felt like watching an old episode of Discovery from a previous season that we haven't seen yet. It was a Saru episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a lot of fun talking about Saru episodes of Star Trek Shenzhou today, but it's not the only thing we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
I thought it was really funny, not funny, but sort of weird. A good contrast that she was actually eaten by Klingons, and then later the Emperor in the Mirror Universe is shown eating a Kelpien. I was just saying, either side of either universes, the species are munching on each other.
Oh dear.
One way.
Oh my gosh.
Warp 5.
So we would have cool firefights at this point. We could bang, pew, pew, stuff like that.
Yes.
Well, you can only do so much in a hallway, dude.
What?
I said you can only do so much in a hallway. Maybe
I don't know.
Maybe in the mess hall. There you go.
Have you seen Star Trek? They're always hiding behind some like bulkhead that's just randomly placed in a hallway.
This is true.
They're all over the place.
Earl Grey.
So she's trying to balance this and she's playing along, but she gets to that point where it's like, and I love that scene as well. It's like, now is the time to listen to me. We've tried to do it your way. It hasn't worked. I'm ordering you to do that or I'll eject you into space. And we know how Troy is. Like, she's the last person you'd think who would eject someone into space.
Yes. Or even threaten that.
But because she's gotten to this point and is in this perilous situation, I believe that she might actually do it, you know?
Melodic Treks.
But the interesting thing about this episode's score, it was composed by Fred Steiner, who did a lot of episodes for the original Star Trek, but this episode did not have a complete score. In fact, there's only about 10 minutes of music that were actually recorded for this episode, and the rest of it was library material. So we're going to focus today on the music that was recorded specifically for this episode, and some of the fun music that entails.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So be sure to check out all these shows, and if you have the time, join in the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get all the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. And if you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
If you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm to get all of the details. I really love the cadence of that. I think I want like a cheerleading squad. Give me a P. Anyway, perks can include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, and those are all available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us. We hope you'll join the team. Again, you will find all of the details at patreon.com/trekfm.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways you can do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, give me a B, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. And if you'd like to send us an email, we would love to have that. Just go to our website at trek.fm/contact, choose to send to a show, and select Literary Treks, and that will come right to us. And you can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
You can also find us on our Goodreads group, where we have bookshelves with all of our previously covered books, as well as the currently reading section, so you know what's coming up for future shows. And of course, there are always great conversations happening about all of the books and comics that make up the Star Trek literary universe. Just search for Literary Treks on Goodreads and click Join Group, and one of us will let you right in. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Norman C. Lau, Ken Tripp, Greg Rosier, Brandon Shemutala, Justin Ozer, and Jeffrey Harlan for their support of the Trek FM network, and specifically for being associate producers for Literary Treks. Thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate it. Now, Bruce, when you're not bravely fending off a Tholian attack with nothing but your wits and an old freighter at your disposal, where can we find you?
I'm so witty to get away from the Tholians. You can find me on Twitter at Admiral_Rex, and you can find me talking Star Wars on the Star Wars Report podcast. And of course, I'm always in the Babel Conference. Give me a B! There you go.
B!
And Dan, when you're not shouting B's or P's when you're going through Saru's cabin, where can people find you?
Well, I'm going to be avoiding that nasty holographic training thing he has set up. That scared the crap out of me.
I know. Scary.
But when I'm not, yeah, no kidding. But when I'm not dealing with that, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kertrats. That's Kertrats. You can find me on Facebook.com/Kertrats Productions and on YouTube at YouTube.com/Kertrats Productions. Mostly lately talking about all the interesting news coming out from behind the scenes of Star Trek Discovery. So lots of interesting stuff there. And of course, you can find me in the Babel Conference. And much like Bruce, if you don't see a lot of comments from me, it doesn't matter. I'm still there. I'm just lurking and reading everything. Well, thank you all so much for listening. And until next time,
live long
and read on.
You call that light reading? To each his own, number one.